Okay, welcome everyone. This seminar is being organized by the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World program at NYU Abu Dhabi. I'm Ayman Shihada and I'm Senior Humanities Research Fellow on the program. And it is my great pleasure to be chairing this seminar and to introduce my good colleague, Professor Abdulla Galadari. Professor Galadari is an assistant professor of Islamic studies at Khalifa University. Before he went into Islamic studies, however, he started his academic career in engineering, and he completed a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Colorado. He then turned to the humanities and obtained a second PhD from the University of Aberdeen, this time in Arabic and Islamic studies. Professor Galadari has been highly productive in his research, which has focused primarily on Quranic hermeneutics. He takes a philological and historical approach to the subject, and he is particularly interested in studying the Quran against the backdrop of late antiquity. His publications include a monograph titled Quranic Hermeneutics Between Science, History, and the Bible, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2018. And impressively, he has two further monographs currently in press. The first titled Metaphors of Death and Resurrection in the Quran, an intertextual approach with biblical and rabbinic literature. This is coming out also with Bloomsbury later this year. I've Googled it and I can see that it can already be pre-ordered online. His second monograph is titled The Spiritual Meanings of the Hajj Rituals, a Philological Approach, and I'm looking forward to both publications. The paper he's presenting to us today is on Israelite Exile and Return, Allusions to Jewish Liturgy in the Quran. And without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to our distinguished guest speaker. Abdullah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ayman, for this wonderful introduction. I mean, I don't think I really deserve that much of an introduction, but thank you so much for it. Let me share with everybody my presentation. I will be going the presentation a little bit, maybe you might find it a little bit quick, but hopefully you'll be able to really see the interesting parts of it, and perhaps also trying to understand the kind of complex intertextualities that there are between the Quran and the Hebrew Bible, as well as the rabbinic literature. And in here, of course, I'll be talking about the Israelite exile and return, allusions to Jewish liturgy in the Quran. Now, obviously, something that many people will always ask, now, does the Quran really discuss the Israelite exile and their return? Because why would it, right? So why would the Quran even discuss something like that? Does it engage with Jewish liturgy? So does the Quran even engage with Jewish liturgy? And why would it do that either? So basically, what we will be looking at is we will closely look into the context of the passage in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter of the Quran. And it's two verses in there, which is 259 to 60 of that chapter. And so if we look a little bit into 259 basically talks about a man who passes by a town that is completely destroyed or completely empty. So it's an empty town. And then asks, how shall God give life to this after its death? So God caused him to die for 100 years, then raised him up. And he said, how long have you tarried? He said, I tarried a day or part thereof. He said, no, you have tarried 100 years. Look then at your food and your drink. They have not spoiled. And look at your donkey, and that we may make you a sign for humankind. And look at the bones, how we set them up and clothe them with flesh. When it became clear to him, he said, I know that God has power over all things. So this is verse 259 of this passage. And verse 260, immediately after, it basically says, when Abraham said, my Lord, show me how you give life to the dead. He said, do you not believe? He said, yes, indeed, but so that my heart may be at peace. And then God asks Abraham to take 4 birds and make them be drawn to him, then place a piece of each of those birds on every mountain, and then calling calling those birds, and they will come to him in haste. So those are the two verses in the Quran in which we will be looking into, and I will be arguing that it is actually engaging with Jewish liturgy. Now, of course, when we open much of the commentaries in the Quran, most commentaries by the early Muslim and medieval Muslim scholars, they would say that those two verses is talking about the eschatological resurrection. So it's talking about the resurrection of the dead in the future, and that it's basically giving us proofs of God having this kind of power for the resurrection. Well, let's look into the background first. I will speak first on verse 259, where the man is actually passing through the desolate or the empty town. And then we will look into verse 260 and seeing them all in their fuller context within this chapter in the Quran, and see how it actually perhaps engages with some of the Jewish literature and also with the Jewish traditions. So in the first verse, verse 259, the man passes through a desolate town and asks God, how will this town be brought back to life? So of course here, the question of life from death does not really signify the resurrection of a human being or even of a non-human animal. It's really talking about an empty town and how will this empty town be brought back to life. So this is very interesting. When we go back to the traditional Quranic commentaries, they usually identify this man in this passage mostly with either Ezra and sometimes with Jeremiah, which is also a very interesting thing to note. Now, the traditions, there are two similar traditions within the Jewish literature about also a man who actually sleeps for 70 years. There is the tradition of Honi Hamagel, who is the Honi, the circle drawer, who sleeps for 70 years, which is the total number of the years of the exile. And there are basically two different traditions of Honi, the circle drawer, one in the Babylonian Talmud and the other one in the Jerusalem Talmud. And I'll speak a little bit of each one of them in a little while. The other tradition that is also bears some similarity with that in the Quran is that of Abimelech, who was with Jeremiah, according to 4 Baruch, and had slept for 66 years during the exile. So he basically slept for 66 years, and then he woke up just as the exiles were going to return back to Jerusalem. Now, both traditions, whether it is Honi, the circle drawer, or that of Abimelech, they're both related to the exile. And when early Muslim commentators identified the man in this Quranic passage as either Jeremiah or Ezra, it might have been the case because they somehow were able to relate this story with the exilic traditions, because both Jeremiah and Ezra are very major figures and had major roles in the exile. So there might have been some Jewish traditions that existed in the early Muslim history that combined these exilic traditions. The Babylonian Talmud version of Honi the circle drawer basically tells us about how Honi sees a man planting a tree that takes 70 years to grow. And Honi asks this old man, like, do you think you will live long enough to see it bearing fruit? And the old man said, well, just as my ancestors planted the trees in which I am eating from, then I'm planting trees for the future generations to be able to also eat from them. Also in the Babylonian Talmud, Honi, the circle drawer, has a donkey. And after Honi actually sleeps for the 70 years, he sees the tree that he was asking, whether the old man will survive long enough to see it bearing fruit. So he wakes up after 70 years, and he sees the tree being fruitful. And though he doesn't see his own donkey, but he does see that his donkey actually brought forth many generations of offspring. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it has a slightly different version of Honi the circle drawer. It says that Honi basically sleeps for 70 years near the time of the destruction of the temple to the time of the exile returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. There are also obviously many earlier traditions that have this kind of what we would call the long sleeper traditions, where you have people who would sleep for a very long period of time. And the Jerusalem Talmud account might be actually related to three earlier traditions, one from Ben Sira, another one from Second Maccabees, and obviously perhaps also with 4 Baruch itself. There are many different really earlier or what we could call proto-traditions to those that exist in the Jewish traditions. Now let's look into the other version besides the ones from the Talmud, but let's look into 4 Baruch. So 4 Baruch basically tells us about Jeremiah is told by God of the impending destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the Israelites to Babylon. However, the prophet Jeremiah pleads with God to show mercy to Abimelech by not allowing him to see Jerusalem destroyed and its inhabitants taken captive due to the kindness he has shown. So God accepts Jeremiah's plea and tells him to send Abimelech to a vineyard where God will hide him in the shadow of the mountain until the people from the exile will return back to Jerusalem. So Jeremiah then asks Abimelech to take a basket of figs and go to the vineyard along the mountain road to bring some figs to the sick people. Meanwhile, Baruch weeps for the destruction of Jerusalem and sits in a tomb. The text doesn't really identify this tomb, nor does it even tell us why Baruch is actually sitting in this tomb. But it is possible, according to some Jewish traditions, that the tomb is actually a metaphor for the Israelite nation who were exiled outside of Jerusalem. Well, according to the version in 4 Baruch, Abimelech takes a basket and collects figs under the burning sun. And since it is too hot, Abimelech decides to rest under the shade of a tree and basically sleeps under the shade of a tree for the 66 years during the time of the exile. Now, we could see there are some similarities between this text and the Quranic passage with two main differences. The Quran narrates that the man actually died for 100 years, while Abimelech only sleeps for 66 years. The Quran also states that the man had a donkey, while there is no mention of a donkey in 4 Baruch with Abimelech. Although Huni, the circle drawer, if you remember, actually had a donkey in the Babylonian Talmud version. Nonetheless, in both cases, in the Quranic verse as well as in 4 Baruch with Abimelech, the man actually has ripe fruit. In Abimelech, for example, he has figs that continue to be ripe, so they don't spoil after so many years. So according to 4 Baruch, the story continues with Abimelech after waking up is taken to the tomb where Baruch had been sitting all that time, when the Israelites were in exile. Basically, what's very interesting about the figs itself is that the figs in the Jewish tradition, as well as in the Hebrew Bible, is usually symbolic for the Israelite nation. So as the nation of Israel. So the figs are used as a symbol for the nation of Israel. And sometimes also in the Talmud, it symbolizes the Torah itself. So some people in the Jewish tradition, for example, some of the rabbinic literature would tell us that the story in 4 Baruch about Abimelech seeing that the figs continued to be ripe is actually to show that the Israelite nation continued not to be spoiled even after the exile, and that the Torah had been restored, because according to Jewish tradition, the Torah had been lost when the Israelites were in exile, and it was Ezra who actually restored the Torah. So basically in 4 Baruch, Baruch interprets the ripe figs that he saw to mean that his flesh and heart would be given life and resurrected if he actually does what the angel had commanded him. And Baruch apparently knows that whatever he is seeing is a sign from God that the Israelites will return back to Jerusalem. And to give the news to Jeremiah, Baruch ties a letter and 15 figs from Abimelech's basket to an eagle's neck who goes all the way back to Babylon and sits outside the city. And basically the place where that eagle sits is a graveyard in which Jeremiah and the people come to this place to bury a corpse of a dead Israelite, and as the eagle comes down on the corpse basically gets revived or gets resurrected. So we can see here this kind of motif of bringing life back to the dead, or the motif of resurrection, very similar as it is also in the Quranic verse. So is the Quranic version really coming from the Talmud, or is it coming from 4 Baruch? Actually, there are many different hypotheses. We can basically think of 4 hypotheses. Perhaps both narratives served as a subtext for the Quranic narrative, or maybe there was an oral tradition of 4 Baruch that also adds a donkey, which was based on Honi's narrative, and that itself served as a subtext for the Quranic narrative. Or maybe the Quran is referring to a completely different tradition that evolved from proto-traditions that gave us or gave rise to the Talmudic version as well as the version in 4 Baruch. Or maybe it could have also been a post-tradition that combined those two together. So it's really difficult to identify which version is the Quranic using as perhaps a subtext. Now let's go to the second verse, which is verse 260, talking about Abraham and the birds. So in that verse, it talks about Abraham believing God's ability to resurrect the dead. So it says that Abraham believes, yet he asks for a sign. So God asks Abraham to do a ritual as a proof. And that ritual is, of course, bringing 4 birds, bringing them together, and then separating them into different mountains, calling them, and then they will return back to him. Now, what is interesting is that there seems to be some allusions to this verse with Genesis 15. Genesis 15 speaks of Abraham also believing in God, who tells him that God will grant him children, will grant Abraham children. And also it tells about Abraham being granted land as well. So Genesis 15 talks about the promise of children as well as the promise for land. And it does say that Abraham believed and yet asked for a sign. So very similar here as we could see with verse 260. So Abraham believes, but still asks for a sign. And so God asked Abraham to also do some kind of a ritual as a proof for the promise to be fulfilled. And I will explain to you a little bit more about that ritual in Genesis 15. There's also similarity with Romans 4 in the New Testament. So in the epistle to the Romans, we actually see Paul also tells us, Paul alludes to Genesis 15 on the promise of children and the promise of land, speaks of Abraham believing in God, in that he will have children, and that also God has the power to raise the dead. So we also see that in the epistle to the Romans, the motif of resurrection is also brought up, as it is in verse 260 in the Quran as well. So in the Quranic account, it basically says, my Lord, show me how you give life to the dead. And it says, do you not believe? He said, yes, indeed, but just for my heart to be at peace. And then he asked him to take 4 birds and put them together, and then place a piece of them on every mountain, and then calling them, and they will come back to him. Now, in the Genesis account, what is interesting is that in the Genesis account, it basically tells us about the promise by God to Abraham, a promise of children and a promise of land. And basically it says that Abraham actually believed and yet asked for a sign. And so God asked Abraham to do some kind of ritual. And the ritual is to bring a heifer, to bring a goat, to bring a ram, and to bring 2 kinds of birds, a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And what Abraham did is that he cut all the animals in half except for the birds and put them on top of each other. What is also very interesting, and that is why you also see in blue at the top, it says, fear not, Abraham, I am your shield. Keep that in mind, because when we will start discussing about Jewish liturgy, you will see how that statement from the Hebrew Bible is very important in Jewish liturgy. And actually, this statement, which is Abraham, I am your shield, this is the only place in the whole Hebrew Bible in which God basically tells Abraham that God is Abraham's protector, or God is the shield of Abraham. Very important, especially in the Jewish liturgy, as you will later on see. Now, what is interesting in the Jewish tradition is that a childless person is actually usually made equivalent as if someone is dead. So if a person does not have children, they are equated as if they were dead. And this is based on a passage in Genesis. We can see the Babylonian Talmud also talks about different kinds of deaths. And one of those kinds is like a person who has no children. Also in Genesis Rabbah, it also basically in its interpretation of Genesis 15, where it talks about the promise of children to Abraham, it actually does say that Abraham would be builded up through Sarah. And the word builded, of course, ibane, and it even resonates with the word ibn itself, which is the word ben as a child. Actually, there's even a play of words in the Talmud in which it says that don't call them your children, but call them your builders, because bonayach and banayach, they're actually from the same root. So, in Genesis Rabbah, it basically interprets, well, basically that Abraham will be builded through Sarah, in which God will grant him a son through Sarah. And therefore, it would be as if Abraham is really not dead, because he will actually have children. All right, so if we compare this now with the New Testament, with Paul's epistle to the Romans, we can actually also see how Paul alludes to Genesis 15 and actually talks a lot about the motif of death and the resurrection. Basically, as it says, for example, it is written, I have made you a father of many nations in the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead. So here talking, of course, about Abraham. So saying that Abraham believed in God and also believed in giving life to the dead. So believed in resurrection. It's very important to recognize that in Genesis 15 talks about the promise of children and the promise of land and the ritual, but it doesn't really explicitly talk about resurrection. This is actually only found in the interpretations, in the rabbinic interpretations. Whereas we can see in the epistle to the Romans, Paul actually does bring up a lot the motif of resurrection several times when it is referring back to Genesis 15. So it does bring that up several times. And what is interesting is that we can actually see the Quran in this verse is echoing a lot of things from Romans 4. Romans 4, for example, very strongly parallels some of the arguments that the Quran typically makes, reminding Jews and Christians to return and follow the faith of Abraham, because that's what Romans 4 is saying. Romans 4 is basically Paul trying to say, well, don't really just focus on the law, but what is more important than the law is the faith of Abraham. And that is something that we see several times echoed within the Quran as well, where the Quran at many times tells the Jews and the Christians to return back to the faith of Abraham. Another interesting thing also is that both a Quranic verse, 260 as well, Romans 4, put the context of Abraham's faith with God with resurrection of the dead as well. And we can also see that there are some similarities with the phraseology. So the similarity is basically that neither the Quran nor Romans 4 actually use the word resurrection. It actually uses the phrase to give life to the dead instead of the word resurrection. So it also has similarities in phraseology. So there's what we would call some kind of shared language. So there's shared terminologies, shared phraseology, shared context, and shared motifs. Another relationship also that we could see between Romans 4 is that Romans 4 says that basically that God has the power to call into existence the things that do not exist, which is also paralleled with Abraham calling the birds who come forth to him. Now, however, the main difference between the Quranic narrative and Romans 4 is that the Quranic narrative actually speaks of the of a ritual, which Romans 4 does not. However, Genesis 15 speaks of the ritual, but not of resurrection. However, we can see that the Quran is actually doing both things. It actually, when it is alluding to Genesis 15, it is referring to the ritual as well as referring to the motif of bringing life to the dead, or the motif of resurrection. Also, basically, in Romans 4, we can see basically that even though God, basically Abraham believes in God and believes in the power of raising the dead, and uses this kind of motif to also show that the definition of death is really Abraham having children. It's basically like Sarah had her womb was like dead because she did not bear any children, but God revived her dead womb and basically allowed for Abraham and Sarah to have children, and therefore they're not really childless, or in other words, they were brought back from the dead. Now, the Quranic subtext, what is really the Quranic subtext? Is it really Romans 4? Is it Genesis 15? Is it something different? Again, very similar to verse 259. It's very difficult to identify what the Quran specifically engages with. Is it really engaging with Romans 4? Is it engaging with Genesis 15? Because it uses some things from Genesis 4 that's, from Romans 4 that is not in Genesis 15, but it also uses things in Genesis 15, but not in Romans 4, even though we do know that Romans 4 is actually referring to Genesis 15. So it might be that maybe the Quran is engaging with both Romans 4 as well as Genesis 15, or maybe neither of them. Maybe it's actually referring to another tradition, most likely maybe a Christian tradition that itself is exegetical of Romans 4, and the Quran is using that as perhaps a subtext. Now let's look into Genesis Rabbah, a rabbinic interpretation of the book of Genesis. And basically in the rabbinic interpretation of the ritual that Genesis 15 tells us Abraham did, it says that the animals being divided and placed on top of one another shows how the kingdoms, how the Gentile kingdoms, so the non-Israelite kingdoms will be divided and go against the others, while the birds, they symbolize Israel, or the Israelite nation. And they are not divided. But the two birds, the reason they are there two birds is because they symbolize both the northern and the southern kingdoms. Of course, historically, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the divided kingdom after the united monarchy. So after the death of Solomon, according to Jewish tradition, the Israelite nation was divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom. So in the rabbinic tradition, or the interpretation of Genesis 15, the two birds are symbolizing those two kingdoms. Now, what is interesting, the Quran doesn't actually tell us about two birds, it tells us about four birds. And perhaps it actually is showing those four birds, if it is using the same kind of symbolism, that the birds is actually symbolic of the Israelite nation, perhaps the reason they're four birds is because the Quran might actually consider the nation, or the Israelite nation, to have been dispersed to the four corners of the earth, and yet, even though they are dispersed into the four corners of the earth, they do come back together. Now, why is that important? Because you will see in a little while how all of these things would make sense if we understand that the Quran is actually perhaps engaging with Jewish liturgy. Now, also in Genesis Rabbah, in the rabbinic interpretation of the book of Genesis, it interprets that when Abraham drove away the birds of prey that came upon the carcasses, is that God is hinting to him that when his children become as carcasses, so when his children are like dead, so again, here the motif of death and resurrection. So even when his children are like dead, his merits, so Abraham's merits, will actually support them to bring them back to life, So that, of course, is metaphoric. So this is very important to recognize the idea or the motif of resurrection that does exist in the rabbinic tradition and in their interpretation of Genesis 15. Because as I said, Genesis 15 explicitly does not refer to death and resurrection, but we do see much of the rabbinic tradition, as well as we also saw in the New Testament, that motif is always and part of an interpretation in the interpretation of Genesis 15. Okay, so what does that really all mean? So what does that mean? So is Quran 259 has so many intertextualities with the rich traditions circulating in line with Abimelech of 4 Baruch, or Honi the circle drawer of the Talmud. In the Talmud, Honi the circle drawer sees his own grandchildren, sees that his donkey had generations of offspring, sees that seeds flowering, and sees his own teaching surviving. So again, the donkey, for example, having offspring, which also could mean, if we understand that having children means a person is not dead, and having no children is likened to someone who is dead. So the donkey having offspring in the Talmud, it's as if the donkey is not dead because it has many generations of offspring. Also, perhaps the Talmud intended to reflect a certain part of the Babylonian Talmud in which it interprets, may you see your children's children, peace be upon Israel, in that regeneration through birth guarantees the survivability of Israel. And according to Genesis 30, also a person without children is likened to a dead person. In 4 Baruch, death is a metaphor for the destruction of Jerusalem and the Israelites scattered and subdued by other nations, and that resurrection is understood as the Israelites returning back to Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple back to its former glory. And that's very interesting because in both passages, 259 and 260 in the Quran, we could see that 259 may not really depict a literal resurrection of bodies leaving their graves, but actually possibly the physical resurrection of a nation that was destroyed and being rebuilt. So that would resonate perhaps with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And in verse 260 appears to allude to God's covenant with Abraham, promising both children and land. And it is possibly that maybe the reason why verse 259 talks about the man dying for 100 years. Remember, Honi, for example, in his traditions, he only sleeps for 70 years. Whereas in 4 Baruch, Abimelech sleeps for only 66 years. Yet the Quran tells us in 259 that the man actually dies or sleeps for 100 years. And I actually would think perhaps maybe the Quran is identifying this man neither with Ezra nor with Jeremiah, not with Honi, not with Abimelech, but is perhaps using it as an identification for Abraham. Why? Because Abraham begat actually Isaac when Abraham was 100 years old. And in the epistle to the Romans, Paul actually explicitly says that God gave Abraham Isaac and basically gave life back to the dead womb of Sarah when Abraham was 100 years old. So it explicitly even brings that issue up and that specific number up as well. So now, why is the Quran really interested in recounting traditions about the Israelite exile and return? So many of us, of course, will ask, okay, so very interesting. That's really good and to know. But why? Why would the Quran really talk about the Israelite exile and return in a very subtle manner in these two passages in the Quran? Well, it will really make sense if we try to actually bring in the Jewish liturgy in the picture, because we can see there are many intertextualities between those passages, and not only those two verses, but the full context of those two verses. So the passages, some of the passages before and the passages after, when we bring them all together, we can see there are so many intertextualities with Jewish liturgy, especially with the daily recitation of the Shemaʿ and the 3 daily Jewish prayers, the ʿAmidah. Well, and then we would say, oh, now it could make sense if that's what the Quran is trying to refer to. So let's look into the first point of intertextuality. Well, of course, the two passages discusses resurrection, and it's talking about something perhaps that most people would think about, an eschatological thing, something that will happen sometime in the future. And of course, in the Jewish liturgy, we also do see the understanding of the end of days, of the Messianic age, of the ingathering of the Israelites and their return from the diaspora back to the land that God has promised them. So we do see that kind of relationship between now these verses and Jewish liturgy. The second point of intertextuality is that we can see Quran 260 uses four birds. Remember the four birds? If the four birds are symbolizing the Israelites scattered to the four corners of the earth, and then Abraham calling them to bring them back, this actually parallels the ʿAmidah's 10th benediction, which says, sound a great shofar, which is the ram's horn of the Messiah, for our freedom, and raise a flag to gather our exiles and assemble us together quickly from the four corners of the earth to our land of Israel. So we could see here that the number four very significant in the Jewish liturgy as a symbol of the Israelites being scattered in the four corners of the earth, and yet they are to return back. Third point of intertextuality, if Quran 2:259 is alluding to the restoration of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, then this would parallel the ʿAmidah's 14th, 15th, and 17th benedictions, which are prayers for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the coming of the Messiah, and the restoration of the temple. The fourth point of intertextuality, if Quran 2:58 through 260 uses Abraham as the one who seeks to ensure that the resurrection and restoration of the Israelite nation, then this would also parallel the ʿAmidah's first benediction. Remember, I told you to keep in mind in Genesis 15, in which God is the shield of Abraham. And this is the only place in the whole Hebrew Bible where God is using the phraseology that God is the shield of Abraham. And this is recounted in the daily ʿAmidah, in the first benediction of the daily ʿAmidah. So again, here we can see that the Jewish liturgy itself is referring back to Genesis 15. On the promise of children and land to Abraham. The fifth point of intertextuality, the context of Quran 2:59 to 60 is within an overarching imploration of giving charity. Immediately after Quran 2:60, for example, the Quran actually speaks in a relatively long discourse about the importance of charity. And even earlier than that, actually just because the context of all of this is also within the context of the throne verse, and immediately before the throne verse in the Quran, it also basically talks about the importance of giving charity. So it seems strange to actually discuss resurrection within the context of charity. So why is the Quran talking about resurrection within the same context as resurrection? Well, interestingly, giving charity is related to the ʿAmidah, to the daily Jewish prayers in rabbinic traditions. The Babylonian Talmud actually states that paying charity to the poor is very important to be granted an audience with God. So it's like, for example, you want to enter, let's say, a museum, and you pay the tickets to be able to enter the museum. And so it's the same thing in here. So if you want to be granted audience with God, then you need to pay something. And that payment is basically charity. And what is interesting, of course, that charity is not only related to prayer and rabbinic literature, but almost always, whenever the Quran is talking about almsgiving, it's almost always conjoined with prayer. So the zakat, the almsgiving in the Quran, is almost always also related with prayer in the Quran. Now, the sixth point of intertextuality, verses 259 and 260 has been placed within the context of God redeeming the Israelites and returning them from exile within the discourse on charity. Now, in the Talmudic discourse, charity also has the power of redemption. So that is also another thing. So the reason is because charity, according to the Talmud, has the power to redeem. Another thing that is also very important is that the Quranic passage is very particular that it is redeeming in the context of death and resurrection. And the Talmud further states that while 10 strong things exist in the world, death is the strongest of all, yet charity saves from death as well. So charity can redeem people from death. So we can here now see the importance perhaps of why the Quran is actually talking about charity within the context of resurrection. The 8th point of intertextuality is that the Talmud continues with a tradition, is that whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. Because the Talmud, when it actually has its own long discourse on charity, it talks about whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and we can see that this actually resonates with a passage that just precedes the throne verse in the Quran within the same context of verses 259 and 260 that we've been closely looking at. And that verse says, "Who shall lend unto God a goodly loan, which he will multiply for him many times over?" And so we can here even see this kind of similarity between the Talmudic interpretation of the charity discourse, as well as in this context of the Quran as well. The 9th point of intertextuality is the interpretation in the Talmud refers to Proverbs 10:2 and 11:14, which both have a similar message. And that similar message is that wealth is irrelevant on the day of wrath, but righteousness or charity, because sadaqah in Hebrew is the same word, is the same term for righteousness and charity. So that's why it has dual meanings. So righteousness or charity delivers from death. And the phrase unrighteousness delivering from death is mentioned twice by both passages. It is interpreted that one of them, which is Proverbs 11:14, which talks about the day of wrath, is that charity delivers from hell. Whereas the second one, which is Proverbs 10:2, about charity is interpreted the deliverance from unnatural death. So one of them delivers from hellfire, and the other one delivers from unnatural death. So we can actually see both being eschatological, being about redemption, talking about resurrection as well, or that charity itself has this power of resurrection, giving it in context why the Quran is actually perhaps giving this context of charity within the passages about resurrection. For example, what is important is that the Talmudic narrative continues to suggest that that this charity, which delivers from unnatural death, occurs when the giver does not know to whom he is giving, and that the recipient does not know who the giver's identity is. In Quran 2:64, within the same context of the passages in question, it also warns the uselessness of someone giving charity to boast in front of people. And Quran 2:71 says it is also explicit that while one can give charity in the open, it is still better to do it in secret. And Quran 2:64 also warns against those who give charity to boast before others, because in the Talmud it warns, the rabbis actually warn not to be like the idolaters who only give charity in order to boast in front of others. So I only have a few more slides to go, so hopefully we'll be done in a little while. The 11th point of intertextuality is that Quran 2:62 through 2:64 emphasizes the importance of not following charity with hurtful words. So when you give charity, don't be hurtful when you're giving charity. And Quran 2:63 actually is very specific that saying kind words are even better than giving charity if that generosity is followed by hurtful words. And this, by the way, also resonates within the same Talmudic passage about charity, in which it says that anyone who gives a coin to the poor is blessed with 6 blessings, and anyone who speaks to him in a comforting manner is blessed with 11 blessings. The 12th point of intertextuality is that during the relatively lengthy discourse on charity and emphasizing using kind words thereafter, verse 269 abruptly speaks of those given wisdom. So, so it talks about charity, and then it talks about people given wisdom, and then it continues, the Quran continues talking about charity again. So why is this abrupt change in style? Well, what is interesting is that even in the Talmudic discourse on charity, it basically, in the middle of that discourse, it also jumps into the idea of wisdom. It basically says that whoever is accustomed to do acts of charity gains the merit of having sons, of course, here getting children, or the promise of children, if you like, merit of having sons who are masters of wisdom, wealth, and lore. So again, here charity and wisdom are still associated with one another in the middle of the passages on the Talmudic context of or discourse on charity. 13th point of intertextuality is that the ʿAmidah emphasizes the power of God. He's the only one to redeem the Israelites, and there's no place in its theological construct for a human redeemer. Even in its messianic motif, God's power is invoked, and it is only God who shall provide salvation and redemption. While this theme is no different in the theological construct of the Quran, the throne verse, which is within the same context of Quran 259 to 60 that we were discussing, so the throne verse also makes it very clear that no one may even intercede with God apart from God's own permission. So again, it's only God's being power and power of salvation and redemption is being invoked. And immediately before Quran 259 to 60, which is 258, it talks about the power of God is contrasted with the power of a human king, to emphasize that no power is comparable, since God not only gives life to the dead, but also brings the sun from the east, which itself is also resonating with the Babylonian Talmud, that the sun rises in the east because, according to the Babylonian Talmud, it does so in obeisance to God. And the last 14th point of intertextuality is that the Quran's engagement on the direction of prayer, because in the chapter 2 of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, before it comes to the passages 259 and 260, the Quran engages with the direction of prayer. It talks about the direction of prayer. And therefore, it must recognize about something in Jewish liturgy, because in the ʿAmidah, for example, the Jews need to pray towards Jerusalem, which tells us that this chapter in the Quran must be aware, it must be aware of the Jewish liturgy, of the Jewish ʿAmidah. Not only is it aware of the ʿAmidah, but it must also be aware of the Shemaʿ, because elsewhere I have also argued that the Qibla passages in the Quran, which talks about the direction of prayer, is also alluding to the Shemaʿ. The recitation of the Shemaʿ. And even the recitation of the Shemaʿ, we can see the issue of the ingathering of the Israelites from the four corners of the earth being also recited. So in conclusion, the traditions alluded to by Quran 259 to 60 appear to share a common theme, which is the Israelite exile and the diaspora and their return. And there are several points of intertextuality that are identified, suggesting that this passage is actually engaging with Jewish liturgy, especially the daily ʿAmidah and the daily recitation of the Shemaʿ. And this Quranic passage is in the same chapter that discusses the direction of prayer. Therefore, it must recognize not only how the Jews pray, but perhaps also the content of their prayer, which is the ʿAmidah and the Shemaʿ recitations. So, and therefore also the Jewish audience of this Quranic passage is more likely those who do adhere with Rabbinic Judaism. So thank you all so much. I do know that I have gone a little over my time, but there was lots to discuss. So thank you all so much for your very kind attention. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Abdullah. Okay, so we have time for questions and answers. Please, if you have any questions, then please type them into the Q&A section. I already have two questions here, but I'll start with a question of my own. You referred at the very end of your presentation to the audience, the target audience of the Quranic text. So, I mean, the standard reading of these biblical elements, let's say, in the Quran is that they're decontextualized and given new significance, new meaning, and implications. So, for instance, the story of the four birds in the Quran, the general understanding is, or the general reading of this passage is that it's as I said, decontextualized, and that in the Quran it becomes purely theological. It's just about resurrection, etc. And again, this is relevant to the audience because that's what's is relevant to the audience of the Quran. So my question is, what's the motivation of the Quranic texts of these passages in the Quran, and who are the intended audience of these passages? And of course, I mean, this is a big question, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, that's a very, very important question. And I would say that perhaps the audience of the Quran here might recognize and understand the Jewish liturgy and what the contents of the Jewish liturgy is, and that it is resonating back some of the same motifs. So when it's talking about resurrection, perhaps it's not really talking about the eschatological day of resurrection and people coming back from the dead, but maybe it's really also talking about the ingathering of the Israelites and the promise, reminding the Jewish audience. It's reminding them of God's promise to Abraham for children and land, and the importance of charity, of how to bring these about as well. So perhaps that is what the Quran is actually engaging with. And because when we actually look into the whole chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah, the big full context of this chapter in the Quran, we can see that it really talks a lot about the Israelites, about the history of the Israelites, the story of Moses, the story of the cow, for example, the golden calf, the red heifer. So it really brings about many things. It engages a lot with the children of Israel. And so it wouldn't really be very surprising if even towards the end of if we think about the chapter with some kind of a ring composition from a literary kind of work. So from a literary composition, we could think of a ring composition in which we can see perhaps that even towards the end of the chapter, the Quran is bringing back these motifs from the Israelite history and liturgy.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a few more questions. So shall I read out the first two? Yeah, the first one is short. What makes Romans 4 relevant, since it isn't considered part of Jewish liturgy? And the second question is, why are there only allusions to intertextuality in the Quran and only very rarely, for instance, Quran 5:45, كتبنا عليهم, rather than explicit, why are there only allusions and very rarely explicit cross-references? Yeah, and this is the second question. Yes, please.
Okay, so to answer the first question, what makes Romans 4 relevant? Well, what makes it relevant is that we could see in Genesis 15, for example, it talks about the ritual, it talks about the promise of children and land, but it doesn't really talk about death and resurrection. We can see only the interpretations by rabbinic literature, in which they interpret Genesis 15 also with death and resurrection. Romans 4, however, it refers to Genesis 15. Of course, it has nothing to do with Jewish liturgy, but it is very much possible. It is very much possible that the Quran might be using Romans 4 as a subtext, because in the epistle to the Romans, generally speaking, Paul is always talking about the importance of faith of Abraham over law. And we can see this kind of thing happening in the Quran as well, where the Quran is several times reminding the people of the book to return back to the faith of Abraham. And in Romans 4, it talks about basically Abraham referring back to Genesis 15, and it talks about Abraham being given life after death, meaning having children, and specifically at the age of 100 as well, which is perhaps giving the reason of why the word 100 years in the verse in the Quran as well. So it might be possible that the Quran is actually maybe using even a Christianized kind of interpretation of Genesis 15 as a possible subtext. And obviously the Quranic community included Jews, but it also included Christians. So, so yes, the audience perhaps here were Jews, but it would also resonate perhaps even with its Christian audience as well. Now, for the second question, which is a very important and a very difficult question to answer, why is the Quran only alludes to perhaps certain texts in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament or in rabbinic tradition instead of explicitly quoting it? And I think the easiest answer to that, even though it's a very difficult question, but I think the easiest answer to that is because how different is that when different books of the Hebrew Bible allude to other texts within the Hebrew Bible? So, for example, when the book of Isaiah tries to allude to certain parts of the books of Moses, of the Pentateuch, for example, it also sometimes uses allusions. It doesn't always say it word for word or quote it word for word. And the same thing we see in the New Testament as well. So in the New Testament, sometimes they don't, most of the times, they don't usually explicitly quote anything from the Hebrew Bible. They sometimes do, but usually they would allude to them. And even actually when they try to explicitly go back to the Hebrew Bible, you'll still even find some terms are actually a little bit different. And so they're not even exactly word for word. So perhaps the Quran is just something very similar. It's just alludes to because it assumes its audience maybe simply understand. Like the later books of the Hebrew Bible, they did not need to quote explicitly because they're assuming their audience will already know them, already know the earlier books. And the New Testament is doing the same idea, and perhaps the Quran is also doing the same.
Okay, another question is from John Zaleski, who says, you mentioned briefly the possibility of a Quranic engagement with Christian exegetical sources as well. And I can see some themes also present in Christian traditions, from the birds to the idea of a death or long sleep followed by revival. Do you have any suggestions of specific Christian sources with which the Quran might be engaging here?
Yes, that's a really important question, and trying to figure out what really is the subtext, and is it really trying to look into some exegetical works, Christian exegetical works of perhaps even Romans 4 and so forth. Well, there are several texts, Christian texts, for example, that talk about the long sleepers, like the seven sleepers, for example, of Ephesus, which, by the way, even in the Quranic version of the seven sleepers in chapter 18 of the Quran, in the chapter of the cave, Surah Al-Kahf, it uses the same kind of phraseology as we also see resonating in verse 259 in chapter 2 of the Quran. So we see the phraseology also resonating in both of them, because in both places, like the question is asked, like, how long have you slept? And it's a day or part thereof. So we can see this kind of phraseology. So, and there are many traditions. Now, in late antiquity, there were really so many traditions that were circulating around about the long sleepers. And so it's really difficult to pinpoint a single tradition here in which the Quran might be engaging with. It might be engaging with one of them. It might be engaging with multiple of them at the same time and bringing them together. Or it might even be engaging with some kind of a proto-tradition. So if we think of it, a proto-tradition with different branches, and then one branch became like what the Babylonian Talmud used. Another branch perhaps was used by some of the exegetical works by some Christian traditions. And maybe the Quran is using from another third independent branch that we don't yet even know about. So it's very difficult because this theme specifically was really popular during late antiquity.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't seem to have any further questions unless anyone can type a question very quickly. No. So, okay, so I think that's these are all the questions we have. So let me conclude by thanking our speaker. Thank you very much, Abdulla, for this very thought-provoking paper. And thank you everyone for attending. and hope to see you again in another seminar. Ron, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. And it's I really greatly appreciate your questions and your engagement and for bearing with me this very quick, fast forward going presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thanks. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.